So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." It's getting quite exciting, isn't it? But the book of Ruth, as John reminded us last week, is really a love story. In some respects, it's a gentle book. It flows naturally, one episode blending into another, so that when you start reading it, you can't really wait till you get to the end. You want to know how it finishes. The lovely thing about the book of Ruth is that although it begins with sadness, it ends with a great deal of joy. It's a book that does have a happy ending. But although this seems to be a gentle story, we might say an everyday story of country folk, there's a little bit more to it than that. And as you've seen probably if you've looked at the workbook, that people have read it through different lenses and from different perspectives. Some have seen here a feminist agenda and have noted the fact that women have the predominant roles in this book. It's one of only 2 books in the whole of the Bible that actually bears a woman's name. The other, of course, is Esther. Some have read it through what's called a post-colonial lens. And that means that you can see insights in the book of Ruth if perhaps you've lived as a stranger in a foreign country. Ruth, after all, was a refugee. She was an exile. She was far from her natural roots. One of the things she had to do in remaining loyal to her mother-in-law Naomi was quickly assimilate herself into what was essentially an alien culture. But for me, one of the important things about the book of Ruth is not particularly the lens through which you read it, but the lovely point it makes in the salvation history of the people of God. Where Ruth comes in the canon, I think, is significant. It comes after the book of Judges, which is a book full of turmoil and chaos, national crises coming one after another, all sorts of mixed characters coming out of the woodwork, people like Samson and Gideon and Jephthah leading the people of God and then fading into the background. The book of Ruth is far more ordinary, and I've called it a celebration of ordinariness. And for me, one of the lovely things about the book of Ruth is not just what it says, but what it doesn't say. It's a book that doesn't speak of any miracle. There's no direct divine intervention in this book. We can search this book as we may, but we won't find direct speech from God reported. There's no direct word from the Lord as such. And it seems to me to be making a very important point that one of the ways in which God works is not necessarily through the sensational and the spectacular, but often through the everyday and the mundane. I'm sure those of you who've been in the Christian church over the years will at times have perhaps felt a little bit threatened, if that's the right word. Maybe that's something we want to discuss in a moment. But more sensational forms of Christianity that have come along. People who have stressed the importance of supernatural gifts and direct divine intervention. I've sometimes had people come up to me after a service and have said, "The Lord's told me to tell you." And I tell you, when people say that, I want to head for the hills. I'm a little bit suspicious of that because, if I'm honest, that isn't my normal experience. My experience is a bit like William Carey's of old. He said, "I've not got many gifts, but I can plod." And I suspect many of us in our local churches have had those experiences of plodding, where there's not been an obvious word from the Lord and guidance hasn't come easily. And sometimes we've been perplexed about the choices we should make. And truth be told, we've often only seen the sense of God's leading when we've looked back upon it from another vantage point. But it seems to me the book of Ruth is powerfully saying that's the way God often chooses to work. The danger is that if we not had those direct supernatural experiences in our lives, we think somehow we're second-class believers. Are we really in touch with the Lord? Are we really doing his will? Are we really following him? It reminds me that Paul says the essence of Christian faith is not walking by sight, but walking by faith. And sometimes that faith is just one step at a time. So that's one thing I want to draw your attention to this afternoon. Not just what Ruth says, but what Ruth doesn't say. It's an ordinary book. It's about ordinary, everyday following God. The second thing I want to say is that one or two key words are now coming into the vocabulary that we ought to pay particular attention to. For the first time in chapter 3, the word Redeemer is used. It's a very short Hebrew word. It's transliterated G-O-E-L, Goel. And it's one of the favourite words of the Old Testament. It means a redeemer, or one who sets someone free, one who perhaps pays a debt for someone else. The Old Testament world was a very precarious world. In times of famine and distress, often people could fall into all kinds of deprivation. It was only a short step then, and indeed we might say it's only a short step today, from prosperity to poverty. And the role of the Redeemer was to actually come and help someone out of a crisis situation. Now, I first heard the word Redeemer because not far from where I was born and bred, there was a pawn shop. Not giving any family secrets away by saying that my mum was a frequent visitor to the 3 golden balls hanging outside, but I did pick up the vocabulary of the pawn shop from a very early age. It was that post-war generation when people felt themselves lucky to be alive, and often money was hard to come by. And if you came on hard times, you could take a valued object and leave it with the pawnbroker, and he would give you some cash for it. If he sold it, well, That was your bad luck. You didn't get it back again. But if you were able to buy it back, you could have it back again. Perhaps you came by some unexpected windfall or some unexpected cash, and you could go back to the pawnbroker and redeem the object that you'd pawned. Do you see the vivid picture language here? And that's the word that now is introduced into the book of Ruth. Boaz is seen as a redeemer. There is, in fact, if we look at chapter 3 carefully, another redeemer. Someone who's an even closer kinsman to Naomi, who has first right of refusal and could, presumably, if he wanted to, step in ahead of Boaz, marry Ruth and redeem the land that belonged to Elimelech the deceased. But this role of the Redeemer is very important from now on. When I look at the word Redeemer, my mind goes to that lovely verse in Job, where Job, in the midst of his suffering, when all his friends have brought to him their words of wisdom and advice, and in a sense they've only made matters worse, Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And it's a word that's embedded in the book of Ruth, and we mustn't read more into it at this stage than there is there. But it's a word that's filled out as the scriptures unfold, until Paul in his letters talks about Jesus redeeming us from the penalty of our brokenness and our godlessness. So let's not just look at the story. It's exciting. Some parts of it are quite intriguing. I sometimes wonder whether Naomi was trying to get rid of Ruth at times. It's a bit of a naughty thought, isn't it? She tries hard to persuade her to go back to the land of Moab. And then the moment they get back to Bethlehem, she's saying, go out and do some work. And then she says, I'm going to try and find rest for you, which is a guarded way of saying, I'm going to try and marry you off. Was perhaps a Ruth coming from Moab a little bit of an embarrassment to Naomi at times? A reminder of a tragic episode in her life that she wanted to forget? I don't know. Perhaps I'm wrong to go up that, and after all, it's only a blind alley. I'd be interested to know what you think. But the book of Ruth is a big book. It's a book that packs a punch way beyond its size, as it's embedded in scripture, reminding us of God's plan. It sometimes works through the ordinary and the everyday. More often than that, that's what calls us to walk by faith and not by sight. But some lovely words are now coming along, not least the word Goel, the Redeemer, who ultimately, of course, is the Lord Jesus Christ himself. So we'll leave it there in our formal introduction, and I would be very interested to know what you've made of this third chapter. There may be a little bit more to it than meets the eye at first reading, but what do you think?